At just 13, Amina's life was no longer her own. One evening, she returned home from school to find strangers in her house. Her father smiled as he announced her fate. She was to be married the next week to a man 3 times her age. Amina pleaded, but tradition had already sealed her future. What happened next would change everything. Forced child marriages are a reality for millions, but what truly happens when a child is robbed of their childhood? If you're new here, welcome. Make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an epic story like this one. And if you've already subscribed, thank you so much for your support. We have discussed everything in this story, and in the end, I have researched a solution for this. And at the end, I will ask a question from you. Let's see how much you know. Now grab your crew and let's get ready for an unforgettable ride. Settle in, relax, and listen until the end. Let's go. Amina's world was painted with the bright colors of childhood dreams. She was a 13-year-old girl from a small village in northern Nigeria, where the sun cast golden hues over the dusty roads and the air buzzed with the sounds of bustling market stalls and laughter. From a young age, Amina had one dream: to become a teacher. She loved school more than anything, soaking up knowledge like the dry earth absorbs the first drops of rain. Every morning, she would wake up before the call to prayer, helping her mother sweep their small compound before rushing off to school. With her books clutched tightly to her chest, she would walk several miles under the scorching sun, her feet kicking up tiny clouds of dust. But the journey never felt long. She would rehearse her lessons in her mind, reciting multiplication tables or practicing new English words. In the classroom, she was a star. Her teacher, a kind woman named Mrs. Aid, often praised her for her curiosity and determination. "Amina, you will go far," she would say with a smile. "You will teach the next generation of girls to be just as brave and intelligent as you." Amina held on to those words like a precious secret. At night, she would sit under the dim glow of a kerosene lamp, carefully tracing her letters in an old notebook, whispering the names of distant countries and mathematical formulas. Her dreams were vast, stretching far beyond the walls of her village, but dreams, in her world, were often crushed under the weight of tradition. One evening, Amina's world shifted. She returned home from school to find strangers in their small compound. Her father, a stern man with deep lines of worry etched into his face, stood beside an older man dressed in fine robes. The air smelled of roasted meat and freshly brewed millet porridge, signs of a celebration. Her mother, usually a gentle presence, looked away when Amina met her gaze. "Amina," her father's voice was gruff, "come and greet your future husband." Her heart slammed against her ribs. Future husband? The words felt foreign, as if they belonged to another language entirely. The older man, perhaps in his late 40s, studied her with a satisfied smile, nodding approvingly. "She is a fine girl," he said. "She will make a good wife." Amina's legs felt weak. The world tilted. "But Baba, I'm still in school. I don't want to get married." Her voice came out in a whisper, but the plea in her eyes was loud. Her father's expression darkened. "This is not up for discussion. You are lucky, Amina. Many girls have no choice but to struggle in poverty. This marriage will secure your future." That night, Amina lay awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand how her future had been decided without her. She thought about Mrs. Aid's words, about the classroom where she felt most alive. How could she be a teacher if she became a wife? Tears slipped down her cheeks. No one asked if she was ready. No one asked if she wanted this. In Amina's village and many others across Africa, forced marriage was not seen as cruelty. It was considered a form of protection. Many parents believed they were securing a better life for their daughters. In a society where poverty loomed like an unshakable shadow, marriage was often seen as a way to relieve financial burdens. A girl's dowry could provide much-needed income, and her marriage meant one less mouth to feed. Some justified the practice as a way to prevent disgrace. Amina's father, like many men of his generation, feared that letting his daughter remain unmarried for too long would bring shame upon the family. A girl who reached puberty without a husband was seen as vulnerable to temptation, and if she fell pregnant outside of marriage, it would bring dishonor. Tradition was the final unyielding argument. For centuries, early marriage had been woven into the fabric of their culture. To question it was to question the ways of their ancestors, a challenge that few dared to make. These justifications were repeated so often that they became accepted truths. But truth, Amina would soon learn, could be a double-edged sword. The night before her wedding, Amina sat beside her mother, tears pooling in her eyes. "Mama, please," she begged, her voice raw with desperation. "I don't want to go." Her mother's own eyes were wet, but she shook her head. "It is your duty, my child. One day you will understand." But Amina did not understand. Not when she was dressed in a bridal gown that felt more like a burial shroud. Not when she was led into the home of a man old enough to be her father. Not when she was forced to abandon her books, her classroom, her dreams. And certainly not when the pain of her wedding night left her broken. The reality of forced marriage was nothing like the promises her father had made. Instead of security, she found herself trapped. Instead of love, she felt only fear. Instead of a better life, she was plunged into one of servitude. Her husband was kind at first, offering her small gifts and speaking softly. But as the days turned into weeks, his patience wore thin. He expected obedience, submission. When she hesitated, he reminded her of her place, with words at first, then with force. Amina was no longer a student. She was a wife. A girl who had been a child just weeks ago was now expected to cook, clean, and bear children. The same people who once admired her intelligence now dismissed her dreams as childish fantasies. "Women don't need education," her husband told her one evening when she dared to mention school. "Your duty is here." She wanted to scream. Amina's story was not unique. Across Africa, millions of girls suffered the same fate, married off before they had a chance to grow, their lives dictated by decisions they never made. But the dangers of forced marriage extended beyond stolen dreams. Many child brides experienced severe health complications from early childbirth. Their young bodies were not ready to bear children, leading to conditions like obstetric fistula, a painful and life-altering injury that often resulted in social isolation. The psychological toll was equally devastating. Depression, anxiety, and even suicide were common among girls forced into marriage. Stripped of autonomy, they lost not only their childhoods, but also their sense of self. And the cycle continued. Many of these girls grew up to become mothers who, bound by the same traditions, married off their own daughters, believing they had no other choice. Amina sat by the window of her new home, watching children run past, their laughter ringing through the air. Just a year ago, she had been one of them, free, full of hope. Now she was a wife, and soon she would be a mother. She placed a hand on her stomach, feeling the small flutter of life growing inside her. A new fear took root in her heart. Would her daughter be next? Would she too be forced into a life she did not choose? For the first time in months, Amina felt something stir within her. A quiet, rebellious thought. What if I break the cycle? But how? And more importantly, was it even possible? This was the question that haunted her, and it is the question we must ask ourselves today. Does forced marriage truly protect children, or does it expose them to an even greater danger, the loss of their dreams, their freedom, their future? Amina's fear and confusion as her wedding day approaches. Amina's days had become a whirlwind of whispered conversations, hurried preparations, and a suffocating sense of finality. Every morning she woke up with the same sinking dread in her stomach, the walls of her home closing in on her. The women of the village swarmed around her like busy bees, measuring fabric, applying scented oils to her skin, and adorning her hands with intricate henna patterns. To them, she was a bride. To Amina, she was a prisoner preparing for a life sentence. She watched them in silence, their faces glowing with joy, while she felt like she was drowning. They laughed as they wove beads into her hair, their voices a blur, their hands unknowingly tying the knots of her fate. At night, when the village fell into silence, she would sit by the window, hugging her knees, her eyes searching the dark sky for an answer. But the stars had none. She wanted to run, to disappear, to escape this fate that had been chosen for her. But where could she go? Who would believe a 14-year-old girl over the wisdom of her father, the approval of the village elders, and the weight of tradition? She was trapped. Her parents' mindset, her father's justification, and her mother's helplessness. Amina had tried again and again to plead with her parents, but each attempt had ended the same way, with silence from her mother and anger from her father. The night before the wedding, she made one last desperate attempt. She found her father sitting outside under the neem tree, sharpening his blade. The fire beside him crackled softly. She knelt before him, tears threatening to spill. "Baba, please," she whispered. "I don't want to get married." Her father sighed but did not look up. "Amina, my daughter, you do not understand the ways of the world." "I understand enough to know that I do not want this," she said, her voice shaking. He set his knife down and finally met her gaze. His eyes were hard, unyielding. "Do you think I do not love you?" he asked. "Do you think this is easy for me? You are my only daughter, but a girl must marry when the time is right." "But Baba, I want to go to school. I want to be a teacher." Her father shook his head. "A woman's place is in her husband's home, not in a classroom. You will be taken care of. You will have children and a man to protect you." Amina clenched her fists. "But who will protect me from him?" Her father's face darkened. "Enough, Amina. You are embarrassing yourself. You will be married tomorrow, and that is final." Tears streamed down her face as she turned to her mother. "Mama, please say something, please." Her mother's lips trembled, but she remained silent. Amina's heart broke. Her mother would not save her. She was alone. The village elders' approval, culture and religion as justification. The following morning, the village elders gathered beneath the ancient baobab tree, speaking in low voices as they observed the wedding preparations. "This is good," one elder, Malam Haruna, said, nodding approvingly. "Girls must marry young before they bring shame to their families." "Indeed," another elder agreed. "Amina's father has done well. She will be provided for." An older woman, her face lined with wisdom, spoke gently. "It is God's will. Marriage is a woman's greatest protection." The words echoed in Amina's mind. Protection. They believed they were saving her, but in truth they were sending her into the lion's den, the day she was pulled out of school. Amina's teacher, Mrs. Ade, was the only adult who seemed to understand her pain. "You are making a mistake," she told Amina's father when he came to collect her. "Amina is one of my best students." "My daughter does not need to read books. She needs to learn how to be a wife," her father said coldly. Amina clung to her desk. "Please, Baba, let me stay." Her father grabbed her wrist and pulled her away. As they walked out of the classroom, Mrs. Ade called after them, her voice filled with sorrow. "Amina, do not let the fire in you die." But as she stepped into the world that had already decided her fate, Amina felt that fire flicker. The wedding night horror. The celebration lasted for hours, but Amina barely remembered it. The music, the dancing, the well-wishes, it all blurred together. That night she sat in her new husband's house, her heart pounding. Her husband entered, his heavy footsteps sending shivers down her spine. "You are my wife now," he said, reaching for her. Amina shrank back. "Please," she whispered. "Please don't." But he did not listen. The pain was unbearable. The next morning she lay in bed, broken and bleeding. She had become a wife, but at what cost? Days turned into weeks. Amina learned quickly that in her husband's home she had no voice. She cooked, cleaned, and served him. She did not speak unless spoken to. When he was angry, he hit her. When he was bored, he used her. When she cried, no one cared. She was no longer Amina, the girl with dreams. She was Amina, the wife, the property, the psychological and cultural aspects. As Amina suffered in silence, she began to see the truth. Societal pressure. The village had celebrated her wedding, as if her suffering was an achievement. The women who had once smiled at her now expected her to endure, just as they had. Economic hardships. Her father had seen her marriage as security, but in truth, it had only traded one form of hardship for another. Poverty had stolen her childhood and sold her into suffering. The myth of protection. Marriage had not protected Amina. It had destroyed her. But no one wanted to hear that truth, because to admit it would mean questioning centuries of tradition. and that was something no one dared to do. The days blurred into weeks, and the weeks bled into months. Amina's existence became a cycle of suffering, submission, and silence. Each morning she would wake before the sun, her body aching, her spirit worn thin. She prepared meals, fetched water, and endured her husband's presence with deadened eyes. The other women in the household, his mother and sisters, offered no sympathy. "You are a wife now," they told her when she cried. "You must endure, like we all have." And so she endured, until her body could endure no more. A difficult pregnancy, a battle for survival. Amina was barely 15 when she realized she was pregnant. At first, she felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps she thought if she bore her husband a child, he would treat her better. Perhaps he would see her as more than just a girl forced into his home. But the pregnancy was not kind to her. She was always sick. She could barely eat, and when she did, she threw up whatever she managed to swallow. The dizziness, the headaches, the relentless weakness, her body was struggling under the weight of a burden it was never meant to carry. She pleaded with her husband to let her see a doctor. "You are not the first girl to have a child," he scoffed. "Stop acting like a spoiled child." No one in the household cared. No one saw her pain. She worked until she collapsed. She cried until there were no more tears left to shed. When the time came to give birth, Amina's body could not handle it. The horror of childbirth and its consequences. The labor was long, brutal, and unforgiving. For hours she screamed in agony, clutching her swollen belly as waves of pain crashed over her. The women around her barked orders, push, breathe, push, but Amina was too weak. Something was wrong, she knew it, she could feel it, but there was no doctor, no midwife, no help. Only the women of the household, who had seen births before but knew little of what to do when things went wrong. By the time the baby finally came, Amina was barely conscious. She did not hear its first cry. She did not even get to hold it, because something else had happened. Amina had developed obstetric fistula, a childbirth injury that left her incontinent, unable to control her urine and waste. And in her husband's household, that made her worthless, abandoned and left to die. The smell came first, the unbearable stench of waste that no amount of washing could get rid of. Her husband noticed, his mother noticed, the whole household noticed. Within days, the whispers started. Within weeks, the disgust in their eyes turned to open cruelty. "She is filthy," his mother spat. "She has brought shame into this house." Her husband barely looked at her anymore. He did not touch her, did not speak to her. And then, one evening, he came home with another woman, a new wife. "You are no longer my problem," he told Amina. "I have found a real woman." Amina could not believe it. "You cannot do this," she whispered, her voice weak. He laughed coldly. "I already have." And just like that, Amina was discarded. He sent her back to her father's house, her infant child in her arms, broken, leaking, humiliated, rejected by her own family. Amina had thought, foolishly, that her father would take her back, that her mother would hold her, that she could rest in the place she once called home. But when she arrived, her father took one look at her and shook his head. "You have brought shame to us," he said. "A woman must keep her husband. You are no longer my daughter." Her mother wept, but she did not fight for her. Amina begged, but it did not matter. She had nowhere to go. And so, with her baby wrapped tightly to her chest, she walked away from the only home she had ever known, wandering the streets, the edge of despair. Amina did not know where she was going. She wandered the streets, her body weak, her baby crying. People avoided her, turning up their noses at the smell. She tried to beg for food, but no one wanted to come near her. She slept on the cold ground, hungry, shivering, desperate. She wanted to die. She was certain she would, until a stranger stopped beside her. The women's shelter, a ray of hope. The woman's name was Hadiza. She found Amina curled up near the marketplace, too weak to even lift her head. Hadiza knelt beside her and gently touched her shoulder. "Come with me," she said. Amina wanted to refuse. She had learned not to trust kindness, but she had nowhere else to go, and so she followed Hadiza. She was taken to a women's shelter, a safe house for girls and women who had escaped forced marriages, abuse, and unimaginable suffering. For the first time in years, Amina slept in a bed that was hers. For the first time in years, someone looked at her with care. Hadiza and the other women helped her get medical attention. They took care of her child when she was too weak to do so herself. They did not judge her. They did not turn her away. And slowly, day by day, Amina began to heal. The turning point, rebuilding a life. At the shelter, Amina met other girls like her, girls who had been married off too young, girls who had suffered in silence, girls who had been abandoned and discarded. They shared their pain. They cried together. And in that pain, Amina found something she never thought she would again: strength. Hadiza helped her get surgery to repair her fistula. It was not an easy process, but with time, Amina's body recovered. She learned to read and write again. She remembered her old dream, to become a teacher. But something else burned inside her now, a new dream, a new purpose, to fight, to make sure no other girl suffered the way she had, becoming an activist, a voice for the voiceless. Years passed, and Amina transformed. She became a voice, a force. She joined the NGO that had saved her, dedicating her life to rescuing other girls from forced marriages. She spoke in villages, warning families of the dangers of marrying off their daughters. She fought for laws that protected young girls. She stood before elders, before fathers, before communities, and told them her story. Some listened, some did not. But Amina did not stop, because for every girl she saved, for every child she protected, she knew she was making a difference. She was no longer a victim. She was a warrior. And she would not rest until forced child marriage was nothing but a memory. The weight of trauma, Amina's emotional battle. The scars left on Amina were not just physical. They ran deep into her soul, shaping the way she saw herself and the world around her. Some nights, she still woke up in a cold sweat, the memories of her wedding night crashing over her like a tidal wave. The feeling of helplessness, of being trapped in a body that was not hers to control, still haunted her. She struggled with self-worth, even though the shelter had helped her heal, even though she had become an activist. There were moments when she still heard the voices from her past. You are useless. No man will ever want you again. You brought shame to your family. The words clung to her like a second skin, refusing to fade, but Amina refused to let them define her. Every morning she reminded herself she was not that helpless girl anymore. She had survived. She had found purpose. She had fought her way back to life. But the battle was not just hers alone. Amina's mother, the burden of regret. Back in the village, Amina's mother carried a different kind of wound. She had watched her daughter disappear into suffering, knowing she had done nothing to stop it. She had let fear silence her. Now every time she passed by Amina's old room, she felt a weight settle on her chest. Her husband, Amina's father, never spoke of her. To him, she was dead, a disgrace, a chapter he had erased from their family's story. But Amina's mother, she mourned her child every single day. She had heard whispers of Amina's survival, of her activism. At first, she was afraid to believe it. But one day, she saw her daughter on a television program, speaking boldly against child marriage. She saw the fire in her daughter's eyes, the confidence in her voice, and she wept as she wanted to go to her, to beg for forgiveness. But she knew that no apology could undo the past, her father's unmoved heart. Amina's father, however, remained cold. Women are not meant to speak so boldly, he scoffed when he heard about her activism. She was never a good daughter. But something began to change in the village. Mothers whispered to one another about Amina's story. Young girls who had once accepted their fate as child brides now questioned the practice. Amina's father found himself challenged in ways he never had before, but he remained steadfast. To him, Amina's downfall was her own doing. He refused to acknowledge the role he had played in her suffering, the stigma of an abandoned woman. Amina's activism did not erase the stigma she carried. Even in the cities where she worked, there were people who looked at her with pity, or worse, judgment. Some still called her damaged goods. Some refused to take her seriously because she had been a child bride. You were weak, one man told her at an event. That's why your husband left you. Amina clenched her fists, rage burning inside her. But she did not argue. She knew that words would not change minds overnight. Instead, she continued her work. She focused on the girls who still had a chance to escape. She focused on those who would listen. The broader impact, a society in chains. Amina knew that her story was not unique. Forced child marriage was not just an issue of one girl, one family, or one village. It was a crisis that affected millions, and it had consequences that rippled through entire communities. The cycle of poverty. Girls who were married off young rarely got an education. Without education, they had no job opportunities. Without jobs, they remained financially dependent on their husbands, if they were not abandoned like Amina. This trapped families in poverty for generations. The health consequences. Early pregnancies often led to devastating health conditions like obstetric fistula, just like what had happened to Amina. In some cases, the damage was permanent. Many girls did not even survive childbirth. The psychological toll. Girls forced into marriage suffered from severe trauma, depression, and even suicidal thoughts. Many never received help. Many never escaped. The damage to communities. Amina had met parents who had lost their daughters to childbirth. She had met young girls who had watched their mothers waste away in abusive marriages. She had met village elders who were beginning to question the practice, but were afraid to go against tradition. Child marriage did not just harm the girls. It harmed entire communities, entire nations. And yet, it continued. Other stories. Amina was not alone. Amina's work introduced her to countless other survivors. There was Fatima, who had been married at 12 to a man in his 40s. She had suffered years of abuse before escaping, only to find that her family would not take her back. There was Bintu, who had given birth at 14 and lost her baby due to complications. She was later cast out of her husband's home and left to beg on the streets. There was Zainab, who had tried to run away before her wedding, but was caught and beaten into submission. Each story echoed Amina's own pain. Each story proved that she was not alone. Expert insights and statistics, the hard truth. Amina partnered with NGOs that had been fighting against child marriage for years. She learned the horrifying statistics. Over 12 million girls are married off before the age of 18 every year. In many regions of Africa, nearly 40% of girls are married before adulthood. Girls who marry young are more likely to suffer domestic abuse, early pregnancies, and economic hardship. The risk of dying in childbirth is 5 times higher for girls under 15. Education reduces the risk of child marriage, but millions of girls are denied schooling. These facts fueled Amina's mission. She used them in every speech, every meeting with government officials, every campaign she led, because the truth was undeniable. And yet so many people refused to listen. Resistance and backlash. Amina's fight is not over. Not everyone supported Amina's activism. She received threats. Some called her a traitor to her culture. Some accused her of spreading Western ideas. Some men, enraged by her boldness, tried to intimidate her into silence. But Amina refused to back down. Every time someone tried to break her, she remembered the little girl she had been, the girl who had no one to protect her, the girl who had suffered alone. And she vowed that no other girl would endure what she had, a new generation of hope. Despite the resistance, Amina saw progress. More girls were speaking out. More parents were refusing to marry off their daughters. More governments were enforcing laws against child marriage. Change was slow, but it was happening. And Amina knew that as long as she had a voice, she would keep fighting. Because every girl deserved a chance to dream. Every girl deserved freedom. Every girl deserved a future, and no one, no father, no husband, no tradition, had the right to take that away. Amina knew that healing was not a single moment of change, but a journey, a path she had to walk every day. The wounds of her past were deep, and though they had begun to scar over, there were days when the pain still throbbed beneath the surface. She had been broken, abandoned, humiliated, but she was still standing, and now she had a purpose. For the first time in years, Amina returned to school. It was not easy. She was older than most of the other students. Some whispered behind her back, calling her the disgraced wife. But Amina ignored them. She had promised herself that no matter how long it took, she would reclaim what was stolen from her. Every time she struggled with her studies, she reminded herself why she was there. She was not just learning for herself. She was learning for the girls who had been denied an education, for the ones still trapped in marriages they never chose. When she finally completed her secondary education, she felt something shift inside her. It was more than just a certificate. It was proof that she was not a victim anymore. She was a survivor. And she would make sure that her survival meant something. a mentor for young girls. Amina knew that there were countless girls just like her, trapped, silenced, afraid. So she made a decision. She would become their voice. She began volunteering at shelters and schools, sharing her story with young girls who were at risk of being married off. At first, some of them avoided her, afraid of the truth she carried. But when she spoke, when she told them about her stolen childhood, her pain, her dreams that had been crushed, they listened. One by one, they began to trust her. Some cried as they confided in her, admitting that their parents had already chosen husbands for them. Some were terrified to go home, knowing what awaited them. Amina held their hands, wiped their tears, and promised them something no one had ever promised her: a way out. She connected them with NGOs that fought against child marriage. She spoke to teachers, urging them to intervene when they saw signs of forced marriage. She worked with lawyers, social workers, and activists, building a network of protection for vulnerable girls. And slowly, change began to happen. One girl at a time, one saved childhood at a time. The message: forced marriage destroys, not protects. At every event she attended, every speech she gave, Amina repeated one truth: forced marriage does not protect children, it destroys them. For too long, families had justified it as a way to secure a girl's future. They believed it would protect her from shame, from poverty, from harm. But Amina was living proof that it did the opposite. She had nearly died from childbirth. She had been abandoned, thrown away like she was worthless. She had been denied an education, stripped of her dreams. Her parents had married her off, thinking they were saving her, but in reality, they had nearly destroyed her. And she was not the only one. Millions of girls across Africa, across the world, were suffering the same fate. Amina vowed to make sure their voices were heard, presenting alternative solutions. Child marriage was not just a cultural issue. It was a social, economic, and systemic crisis. If the world truly wanted to end it, real solutions had to be put in place. Education for girls, the ultimate weapon. Amina knew firsthand that education was the strongest defense against child marriage. When girls were in school, they were less likely to be married off. When they were educated, they had options: careers, independence, financial stability. But in many communities, education was still a privilege, not a right. Girls were pulled out of school because of poverty. Some schools lacked basic resources. Some communities did not allow girls to study past a certain age. Amina worked with organizations to push for free and accessible education for girls. She fought for policies that would ensure that girls could stay in school without the fear of being forced into marriage. She encouraged teachers and school leaders to take a stand, to intervene when girls were at risk. Because when a girl was educated, she was empowered. And when she was empowered, she could break free from the cycle of oppression, government policies, and legal protections. Amina knew that laws alone would not end child marriage, but they were an essential first step. She worked with activists to push for stricter enforcement of child marriage laws. In many places, child marriage was already illegal, yet it continued because laws were ignored or weakly enforced. She demanded that governments hold families accountable when they married off their daughters. She called for stronger protections for survivors so that girls who escaped forced marriages could find safety and support. She spoke at international conferences, reminding world leaders that child marriage was not just an African issue, it was a global crisis. And she refused to stop until real change was made. Economic empowerment for families. Amina knew that poverty was one of the biggest reasons parents married off their daughters. Many families saw marriage as a way to secure their child's future, especially when they had no money to support them. If child marriage was going to end, families needed economic opportunities. Amina advocated for microfinance programs to help poor families start small businesses, vocational training for women so that mothers could support their families without relying on their husbands, scholarships and financial aid for girls so that education could be a real option. When families had financial stability, they were less likely to see marriage as their only choice. And when girls had opportunities, they had the power to say no. A future of hope. Amina had once believed that her story was over, that she had been condemned to a life of suffering, but she had rewritten her fate. She had taken back her voice, and now she was using it to fight for every girl who had been silenced. Her journey was not over, There were still so many battles to fight, so many minds to change. But Amina was no longer the helpless girl who had been married off against her will. She was a warrior, and she would fight until no girl had to suffer what she had suffered, until every girl was free to dream, to learn, to live, until child marriage was nothing more than a painful memory of the past. Because girls were not property. They were not burdens. They were not born to be married off. They were born to be free. And Amina would make sure the world never forgot that. Amina's story is just one among millions. Her pain, her struggles, and her resilience are echoed in the lives of countless young girls across Africa and beyond. Girls who have been denied a childhood, an education, and a choice. But we must ask ourselves, do traditions justify suffering? For generations, child marriage has been excused in the name of culture, protection, and economic survival. But at what cost? Amina nearly lost her life. She lost her dreams, her health, and the love of her own family. Yet she fought back. And now the question remains, should we allow culture to be a cage, or can we reshape it into a force for empowerment? What do you think? Should traditions evolve to protect our children rather than harm them? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Let's start a conversation that leads to change. And if you want to learn more about African traditions that need reform, watch our next video, where we uncover other harmful practices that continue to affect millions. Because together, we can break the cycle. Subscribe for more eye-opening stories and powerful discussions. Let's change the narrative. Let's protect our future.